Page is showing fine on YouTube.
Is it started streaming?
Yeah, it started. It started.
Oh, it is not showing here. Okay. So welcome everyone. Welcome to panel 3 of a day-long annual symposium titled Post-Institution at the School of Environment and Architecture. Since afternoon today, we have had two very engaging pedagogic discussions around the question of habitation and visual culture. The anchors of thinking frameworks for pedagogy in spatial studies have seen distinct re-articulations in the current times of the digital. In this panel, we will discuss then the shifts in pedagogy under the influence of the digital, DIY, and the new media ecologies. The classroom in the pandemic is dissolving through digital means of communication and operation with the making and learning cultures through digital means of communication. The cultures of DIY and immense database which is existing online is changing the very nature of the classroom, the field, and the labs. How do these new learning ecosystems generate new models of engagement in pedagogic processes? What is the pedagogy of these modes of engagement? What are the new processes which are intervening in the existing ones? How do we engage when the process is neither top down nor bottom up? We start at any random points. What is the process of an autodidact without an institutional framework? Let us see how this panel opens up these provocations further. I would like to introduce the four panelists for the session. Bubbly Narula. Bubbly Kaur Narula is a computational designer. She's a creative technologist and an educator. Trained as an architect, her work explores the multiplicities in the field of computational design and architectural education. She specializes in interactive technologies, additive manufacturing, and digital fabrication methodologies. She's currently pursuing her mention in research from Elisava and holds an academic position as an assistant professor at Balwant Seth School of Architecture, Mumbai. She's actively involved in developing digital pedagogies for both graduate and postgraduate programs. After receiving her master's in advanced design and digital architecture in Elisava, Spain in 2015, she continued her interest in this field and collaborated with several offices in the design of installations, sculptures, and pavilions, including the installation and exhibition Venice Space, Jaipur, in collaboration with Sameep Padora and Associates Mumbai. Welcome, Bhavleen. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm assistant professor at School of Environment and Architecture and have been engaged with the school since inception. I completed my graduation from University of Mumbai, further to complete my post-graduation in urban design from University of Mumbai. My practice engages with varied questions of academic administration, institutional thinking, urban and technological studies, and sustainable development. Dushant Asher, he's one of my colleagues at the school. He's an architect and technologist who is interested in spatial interfaces of technology and life. He has worked in design and computational domain since his master's at Charlotte Architecture class, Frankfurt. He's currently engaged in research on material studies as a part of his teaching curriculum at the School of Environment and Architecture. Welcome, Dushan. Kush Patel. Dr. Kush Patel is a queer feminist, educator, writer, and a public scholar, working at the intersection of architectural theory, history and theory, environmental design studies, and digital humanities. They have held academic positions and appointments as Associate Faculty Librarian of Digital Pedagogy, as a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Humanities and Michigan Humanities Collaboratory. He was also appointed as an adjunct lecturer in interdisciplinary humanities at the College of Literature, Science, and Arts at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, which is also an institution where they earned their PhD in architecture. Currently, they are affiliated with Avni Institute of Design near Calicut in Kerala, where they teach advanced research design courses, including an urban humanities and community-centered digital storytelling studio, as well as lead initiatives on architectural history theory in relation to online and public knowledge writing. Welcome, Kush. I would briefly like to explain the structure of this session. Each of the panelists will be posing their provocations in the realm of the digital and the specificity of their practice. We begin with four broad categorization, where I would like to open up the idea or the cusp of digital and the bureaucracy, followed by Kush, who would speak through digital and biography. Berlin would then come up with the threshold of digital and multidisciplinary approaches, with Dushan speaking about the interface of the digital and the body. Alongside, alongside as we present you with the provocations and thoughts, I would urge everyone to use the question and answer panel to pose their questions, thoughts, and provocations. We will come back to it at the end of our panel discussion to take up the questions from the audience. I would walk you through my thoughts on the following provocations: how the digital aids transition impacts the experience of building institution infrastructures administratively, how these points connect and help one strategize and navigate the implicated politics, how might they help connect the university and its people across interfaces and vulnerabilities, online, on screen, in person, or in a blended mode. Talking about new media ecologies and the digital. The current configurations of the institution are consolidated over the last centuries, which revolve around documentation and records, hierarchies, stringent norms and regulations. The top down institutional framework is somewhere where we all have been working through. It proliferates not only in the administrative part of the institution, but it also works through the pedagogic thinking structures. The linear processes of institutional structure and teaching learning are dissolving in the post institutional age. The ideas of documentation and record, norms and rules, classrooms, workshops, field, and experimentation are getting reconfigured. The binary between the teacher and the student, the digital and the physical space, are becoming blurred with the ingress of autodidactic learning. Technology and DIY processes are aiding the re-articulations of institutional thinking, pedagogic frameworks, the space of the field, and the classroom. I want to open up this panel by sharing my journey through the institutional ecologies. I entered the School of Environment and Architecture about 7 years ago. In 2014, the school was being conceptualized and formulated by four practices coming together. All eight architects were trying to bring about the much needed shift in architectural education. To set up an institute to bring together a full fledged running course of architecture, we pass through many administrative processes. We require a lot of approvals, affiliations, registrations throughout, and pass through a lot of hierarchies and bureaucratic processes in order to achieve these. I immediately joined the school after my master's, and I was completely caught unaware of this complex system and the loaded frameworks. Entering this unknown terrain of institutional territory and its complexities was nothing less than entering a labyrinth, a complex maze of processes and frameworks loaded with hierarchy and positioning. This labyrinth is further loaded with a set of frameworks, the rules and regulations, which are the minators of these complex processes, which must be pacified at various stages. To deal with these minators, different institutional processes are developed at various stages, and these stages need to be articulated for any institutional framework to be developed. Can digital systems and new ecologies help us create slender systems to navigate the labyrinth? I would share with you two short anecdotes to provoke this discussion further in the panel. Being new to the system, we started scanning through a lot of rules and regulations, through prospectus, through rule books, as these were the documents which were allowing us to understand various of the processes and the steps which needed to be followed. With every administrative process, be it admissions, be it exams, we needed to scan through a series of documents. It so happened that with so many rules and regulations put in forth by the university for a new institution to come in place, we needed to somewhere build our own arguments and build up our own institutional frameworks and thinking. With that, we started kind of in this process of kind of documentation and building up these arguments together. I started taking screenshots of various communication. The digital technology kind of helped me put together very quick records for myself in order to build these arguments quickly and to generate narratives out of them. These screenshots were something which allowed me to keep a record and allowed the arguments to be sequenced. With each of these arguments and through the year, almost after communicating with the university, it so happened that the university started telling us to use the same method to communicate with them. They told us to start taking screenshots and to record these as documentation evidences or documentation processes to keep a record of all the communication in a method of digital archiving. So the screenshot somewhere where it started with me for the ease of method, which I was using for my quick reference, it started becoming institutionalized as a process of digital documentation. Now, what this documentation did was not only create immense amount of data and archiving, and I'm sure that when you are in the system and in that process of using these records, it's very easy to retrieve them and use them. But what happens to these records when they over the time? After 5 years, what happens to the records which are generated in the first year? Are they still that easy to navigate and retrieve and to analyze and assess? Digital technology is aiding all of the documentation processes, but it is at the same time creating a large amount of data, which at times might get unfathomable and difficult to access and retrieve over a large period of time. So these new media technologies, even though they are creating slender systems, it poses me with the question of what happens with so much amount of data which is generated online. The second set of story or an anecdote which I would like to share is about, it hints about the complexity and hierarchy and the heavy-handedness of a top-down approach. So what usually happens is that at the end of each session, the university releases a set of payments. These payments are towards paper checking, they are towards evaluation, juries, for various university duties that you're supposed to do. It so happened that in one of the session, all the checks started bouncing, and being such smaller transactions, they're often not reported. They get kind of missed into the whole system of bureaucracy. So, and I was very young, very fresh into the system, and was very curious to know why these fallouts were happening. I started writing letters to the accounts department of the university to find out if something can be done and what was actually the fallout. The problem was somewhere at the end of the bank. However, even after writing several letters to the university department, I received no resolution or no response for it. So I decided to write a letter to the Vice Chancellor of the university, just to seek some attention to what was happening and to figure out whether something can be done to kind of bridge these gaps. Within 2 to 3 days, I received a resolution for this problem. I received a call from the account department and my concern was resolved. But the question which it left me and that stayed with me for until now, where we are trying to restructure the systems at the school, was do we at all times need to kind of approach the top authority to kind of get a resolution? Can networks and systems be developed in such a way that all individuals working in a system are equally responsible? Can these networks become a better way of forming frameworks or institutional frameworks instead of rolling out hierarchies in the first place? So while dealing with all these norms and regulations, the other way of dealing with it was of starting conversations and discussions. I started talking to various schools in Mumbai as we were setting up our institutional administrative frameworks. He started building new systems. And these networks and friendships created a new alternate system which was passing through the top-down bureaucratic system. The alternate network was of friends. It allowed us to open up new conversation and possibilities to navigate the formal system. The digital space allowed this network to kind of proliferate and sustain bigger conversations. It allowed us to negotiate the formal system. So can these systems itself be multiplied? Can institutional frameworks be based on friendships, collaborations, networks, and not on hierarchies? What would be an institutional framework that would allow such friendships to emerge and sustain? As we see the recent shift in the learning processes, the top-down approach is dissolving. It is dissolving towards a more co-learning environment. And instead of learning from one, we are learning from many. The teacher and the student are learning together. Various technological interventions and networking possibilities are allowing us to destructure, dismantle the hierarchy, and move towards a more flexible organizational form. We have been at the School of Environment and Architecture constantly rethinking and reconstructing the institutional landscape. At the school, we are moving towards structuring or restructuring the hierarchical framework to generate a network of individuals who collectively anchor various verticals at the school, be it in terms of administration, operation, and pedagogic thinking. The school is moving towards a collective interface. It is an interface of practices which talk to each other, which ask questions to each other. They build new knowledge together and develop strategies to counter the institutional fragilities. The aim is to move towards a people centric working system, from a people centric working system to a multidimensional grid, that which will perpetuate and never collapse due to individual lapses. I will now briefly talk about the provocations which each of the panelists are speaking through and invite them to make their presentations. Kush Patel, he co-leads with Ashley Taranto Morford and Arun Jacob, Pedagogy of Digitally Oppressed, an anti-colonial digital humanities practice. It locates itself within cross-disciplinary digital humanities framework to reconceptualize how instructors might approach the teaching of digital skills and tools to destabilize colonial ideologies, which are naturalized through the mainstream digital humanities practices, as Kush would call it. Kush, I will invite you to discuss the question of the digital what. That is, rather than the what and how of digital pedagogic projects, can you talk about a set of pedagogical stories that implicate your background and precarities, as well as structure your queer, feminist, and anti-colonial digital humanities pedagogic practice? Kush, I invite you to do your presentation.
Great, great. Thank you. Thanks, Deepthi. Thank you, everyone at C. What a wonderful way to continue to be part of these conversations, and the digital is affording these connections wonderfully and beautifully. So I'm very glad to be here. Deepthi, also, thanks also for starting us off on your own personal story, a biography, if you will, of your own academic administrative practice. And that kind of is a perfect segue to questions that I hope I'm able to not just pose, but also provide some kind of a material imagination too. So without further ado, let me just quickly share my screen and we can. Okay. If you could just let me know if you're able to see the presentation screen, that would be good.
Sure. Can you go to the present mode?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay, great. So thanks again. And as Deepthi mentioned, I work at the intersections of architecture and the digital humanities, and particularly from a queer, feminist, and anti-colonial perspective. So the title of this presentation is the instructor bio, critiques and positionings in architecture and the digital humanities. Building and navigating an academic career in North America and India, the concept, framing, and device of the instructor bio in a course outline or syllabus has been both a personal and collective project for me, which is to say at once structured around the notion of personhood and accountable to shared voices that make learning and teaching meaningful, even though professionally still precarious. As a way of introduction and an opening provocation to the nested scales of pedagogy in the times of digital DIY new media ecologies, which is the title of this panel, but also pedagogies of the post-institution, which is the thematics of the C annual conference this year, I ask, what might it mean to unpack our instructor biographies in and with the digital, to center knowledges that we travel with, including those digitally mediated by and connected to communities and kin, and others that we co-create through formal ways of engaging in the world. How might the instructor bio extend into a form of micro, collaborative, and digital life writing of the course itself to deliberately blur the binaries of the didact and the autodidact, but also orient this relationship towards desired, participatory, and progressive social and institutional goals. Drawing upon my shared work in critical digital pedagogy, I do want to discuss 3 such micro stories, centering voices that would traditionally be considered non-academic, but through our digitally mediated collaborations, they outline for me and us the limits and possibilities of what we might also then begin to consider the stakes of the post-institution. So I'll begin with notes on the autodidact by writer, sociologist, and professor of library and information science, Tressie McMillan Cottom, who in the chapter entitled Intersectionality and Critical Engagement with the Internet writes, and I quote, "The literature on open education was preoccupied with what I call roaming autodidacts. A roaming autodidact is a self-motivated, able learner that is simultaneously embedded in technocratic futures and disembedded from place, cultural history, and markets. The roaming autodidact is almost always conceived as Western, white, educated, and male. As a result of designing for the roaming autodidact, we end up with a digital platform that understands learners as white and male, measuring learners' task efficiencies against an unarticulated norm of Western male whiteness. It is not an affirmative exclusion of poor students or bilingual learners or Black students or older students, but it need not be affirmative to be effective. Looking across this literature, our imagined educational futures, or even institutional futures, might I add, are a lot like science fiction movies. There's a conspicuous absence of brown people and women. At the beginning of the 2018 semester, winter 2018 semester, I found myself reflecting on this default biography of the online instructor, or what Cottom describes as always a singular, white, cis male, Western, able-bodied, young, and non-poor itinerant with ready access to the internet, digital infrastructures, and open online courses. I was getting ready to teach my own community-engaged undergraduate seminar at the University of Michigan entitled The Plot Beneath the Garden, where students and I were to intentionally locate ourselves at the intersection of histories, languages, and knowledges tied to the everyday lives of our community partners, the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, in the city's North End District. My students were non-traditional, and my community partners were Black women cultivating land and their futures in a city where only 40% have access to the internet. Bridging the gap between Ann Arbor and Detroit then was not just a matter of navigating an induced geographical divide, but also mending the split between online infrastructures and lived realities that remain distinct in race, class, gender, and ability difference. How might we understand people's connection to land and land-based creative and political practices with and beyond the digital? What are the traditions within which the farm members operate to survive their everyday erasures? Which skills and knowledges are part of their visions for the future, and which new skills are being cultivated through this cooperative and community-centered work involving art, architecture, and technology? At the end of the course, which took place in 2 distinct locations as well as online, students were not only able to develop research tactics such as field documentation, interviews for engaged learning, and critical analyses of digital public archive, but also interrelate texts, reflections, and experiences on the ground to develop new understandings of what the city can be and how the digital could have both methodological but also a liberatory significance for its participants. Which allows me to introduce my second story, an experience with critiquing the very form and proliferation of web-based massive open online course, or MOOC, as we popularly know them as, platforms that often involve the singularities, sameness, and privileging of certain types of digital learners that Cottom describes as the roaming autodidacts. That same year, in June 2018, as the week 1 of the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria in Canada drew to a close, I found myself returning to our race, social justice, and DH seminars opening call for transparency in engaged institutional work, asking participants to discuss their situatedness in the world and with the digital, as well as stay committed to developing anti-oppression methodologies of digital research and pedagogy. I also found myself feeling deeply connected to my seminar peers, especially as we unpacked our personal and institutional biographies, made visible what is at stake for each of us in critical digital humanities work, and approached the question of the digital and its citing from both epistemological and lived experiential perspectives. The questions that we really started with, can we build online courses with dissent as their goal to incorporate structures of opposition such that completing a class leads to defiance? And one of the things that I tweeted back then was resist, reconceptualize, repair. So these were the sort of the metaphors and verbs with which I was thinking about the digital infrastructure, particularly as connected to pedagogy. Nothing better than to begin our day 2 of critical praxis with reflecting on guidelines for the ethical development of an online course and raising questions of online teaching and its complicity in the neoliberal academic project. The following week, as part of our DHSI 18 Critical Pedagogy and Digital Praxis in the Humanities course, my peers and I developed an online resource to inform the practices of collaborative teaching towards activism. Led by Chris Friend, this week-long seminar examined the social and political dimensions of digital pedagogy, grounded in the Paulo Freire notion of praxis, and directed towards building community in and through diverse digital learning and accessible environments. Specifically and carefully, we took on questions of race, social justice, and DH from the week 1 undertakings to rethink the colonial histories of teaching and learning practices in and with the digital. Building upon these conversations are in-class engagements with the writings of Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Jesse Stommel, and Kathy and Davidson, as well as FemTechNet's alternative to MOOCs. We created a meta-MOOC and published it in Hybrid Pedagogy, an open access journal that not only connects discourses on critical pedagogy, digital pedagogy, and online pedagogy, but also, as per the introduction, and I quote, considers personal and professional hybridity. So there's already a kind of a transcending of the instructor bio to incorporate how the personal is institutional, is political, and disrupt the distinctions, therefore, between students, teachers, and learners. The meta-MOOC we produced was part of this collectivist orientation to center the understanding of and engagements with digital learning inside the lived reality of the learners themselves, to assist individuals within, without, and alongside institutions to create sites of resistance through digital learning and not simply source information from digital networks. Teaching toward activism, in other words, served as a heuristic and a set of actionable steps for folks committed to place-based and community-oriented justice work. Our web resource outlined approaches that could be adopted and adapted to hone the agentic capacity of learners across personal and professional roles. My collaborators and I, in particular, particularly developed the application component of this course to provide a focused and practical view of how critical engagement and community building might be realized in the context of an online course. We asked, how is it possible to bring online participants together as a community organized around principles of mutual understanding and empathy? What tools and approaches may be used to ensure that course participants develop critical thinking skills by responding to and exploring material through multiple points of view? How may students be taught the constructedness of their values and understanding of themselves and of the world? Through what means would the instructor be able to guide participants and learners to develop awareness of diverse and compounded manifestations of privilege, as well as the ways in which those intersections impact the individual and collective instances of oppression? And how can an online course then translate these questions into and invite forms of radical community engagement? Which brings me closer to my current institutional affiliation and place of work in Kerala. At the recently concluded completely online and remote semester at Avani Institute of Design, my co-faculty and I led a pre-thesis urban humanities studio entitled Cities with Whom, Supporting Infrastructures of Community Protection in Viranium. The studio was positioned as an archive, building upon the intellectual and community framework of its inaugural work from the Monsoon 2019 semester, engaging the infrastructures of equity, access, economy, waste, and climate change in Viranium's fishing villages at the scale of palpability, orienting ourselves explicitly around questions of community protection, and grappling simultaneously with the realities of settler colonialism and indigeneity, even as we work both remotely and online throughout the raging and ongoing pandemic. What are the assumptions about digital community engagements that we carry with us? Whose lives are excluded from online projects, online platforms, online interfaces? And how might we design pedagogies, share resources, and work with and on digital platforms to recenter the lived realities of our partners and students? Over the course of 16 weeks, with neither the students nor the community partners having an opportunity to meet in person, the materiality of the digital upheld the studio's scale of palpability by actively centering archival objects on cloud-based documents, meeting systems, and sharing platforms, facilitating the production mediation of oral histories, image files, sound files, video files, academic scholarship, and community solidarity dialogues. The resulting drawings and spatial propositions centered each of these embodiments towards not just their enactments in community, but also reconceptualizations of the community infrastructural context itself. Throughout the semester, the syllabus became a collaborative document and a co-owned document, inviting students and community members to actively annotate texts and questions, but also add critical insights and challenges towards pluralizing the instructor bio in relation to these engagements. So in light of these micro-resistances to and critiques of digital and online learning, of digital and online learners, and of the digital and online form itself, how might an opening with the instructor bio in all of its personal, political, and pluralizing connotations help us come together and work with local organizers? How might it help uplift and amplify the transformative new media and digital humanities work being led by the oppressed globally? How might this process take action against the ongoing settler colonial erasures of and systemic oppressions towards languages, cultures, knowledge systems, genders, and sexualities in the global north and the global south? What actions and methods with the digital might we add to this process to help lead changes in higher education, in our kinship communities, and in our individual lives? And finally, how might we sustain a digital discourse away from its reduction to an environment or an infrastructure that can be mapped and charted and or owned through extractive projects of the neoliberal academy? Could we start with ourselves? Could we start by following the words of Joseph Jones Jr., personalizing our instructor and institutional bios, weaving our stories not only into the institutions that we currently inhabit, but also those spaces of learning that we wish to sustain and create. So my end slide is actually one that Deepti was able to add in my introduction as well. It's a transnational digital humanities praxis and practice that I co-lead with Ashley, Garanda Morford, and Erin Jacob. And it's a project which continues to sort of grapple with the questions of not just digital humanities pedagogy, but also the construction of digital community engagements and projects that involve microspatial histories. And with that, I will pause so that we can hear from the other panelists as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Kush. Thank you. I'll now call upon Bavleen. Bavleen, through her teaching and practice, she's been looking at digital objects, the idea of digital objects, and her work explores procedural thinking and the autonomy of machines in the post-digital world. I would invite her to elaborate on how pedagogy and educational institutions need to change in this ecology where the classroom seems to have completely dissolved. The autodidacts have emerged. And what is the role then that technology plays in re-articulating the post-institutional frameworks and the digital thinking processes for the autodidacts? So, Bavleen, can I call you to make your presentation?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So let me know if you're able to see the presentation or not. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Dipti, for the introduction.
Oh.
And hello. Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yeah. Yes.
We can, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Dipti, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. My presentation today is broadly based on my experience at my teaching experience at Balwanchit School of Architecture and practices that I have been part of as a computational designer. The dominant mode of utilizing computers in architecture today is that of computerization. Entities or processes that are already conceptualized in designer's mind are entered, manipulated, or stored on a computer system. The fabrication processes further help in rationalizing these complex geometries for a built environment. Mario Capo provides the beginning of a counter-argument to Neil's statement on digitally produced design. Capo identifies the digital character of a design method, arguing for the intrinsically discrete nature of the computational processes. In his book titled The Second Digital Turn, the precedent studies can be divided into two broad categories. Firstly, digital to analog, which is digitally produced and analog methods for fabrication, and secondly, digitally produced and digitally fabricated projects. Michael Hansmeyer's work in the former category broadens on the power of computation and resolution of printing, focusing only on design method and not on fabrication. The designer assumes the existence of a large-scale 3D printer commercially available, such as a voxeljet sand printers. Gramazio Kohler, Robert Stuart Smith's work, on the other hand, reflects on the fabrication logic and machinic tool paths rather than the former process of form searching. The digital materiality primarily defines the final form. Digital assemblages, which is the third category at the bottommost corner, may be seen as an emergent category, eliminating the form searching process completely and designing with machines. Maria Jablolina's work on mobile robotic filament project proposes multiple mini autonomous wall climbing robots to distribute fiber filament using any horizontal or vertical surfaces. These agile mobile robotic systems move robotic fabrication processes beyond the constraints of the production hall. One can imagine a fabrication process where an operator arrives at the scene with a suitcase housing all the necessary robots and materials to create a large structure. Leaving behind the standard construction strategies and seeking unique solution increases the need for learning from traditional techniques in architecture in order to establish a whole new system and reach out to the digital production. Squaring the circle combines the logic and experience of the craftsman in its own unique way with the digital production process. Created as part of an exhibition Venice Space in 2018 at Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur, Squaring the Circle is an architectural installation made from elastane fabric, which with a thickness of about 0.75 mm, stitched together to form catenoidal surfaces to occupy the gallery space. The project is a reflection on the question of methods of fabrication for a digitally conceptualized model. The project was designed and understood in a digitally scripted environment using material behavior studies from analog models. On the other hand, the fabrication process is a result of material engagement between its craftsman and his simple tools. While the prototype at 1:100 scale extrapolates and rehearses the making process embedded in the digital codes, the fabrication logic still remains with its maker and his material knowledge. The elastane fabric was stitched together on a traditional sewing machine used for stitching upholstery fabric. Each unique panel was composed together into strips by stitching the pieces in tension with an elastic thread to accommodate the changes upon releasing the stresses without tearing the fabric. Uh, the, the entire installation was stitched together into one piece, which was then installed in place using J hooks. The intelligent understanding of the craftsman led to simplify the fabrication process further. Unlike other contemporary installation which use tension active fabric system, the material used here, once again suggested by the craftsman, is a regular stretchable fabric procured from local market and does not require any complex material engineering or manufacturing. The work here based on the idea of draw me a code and programming instead of drawing is is the work produced with students at Balwanchit School of Architecture and thrives on the idea of programming a drawing. Programming a drawing entails thinking on the level of machine code, regardless of what the drawing will represent, which program language or which system will be used. Working on the level of computer code means using machine logic and operating with text. The work developed at BSSA in the last 3 years looks at empirical teaching methodologies towards investigating processes involved in computational thinking. Different forces synchronize in an environment, an experimental apparatus, drawing an impression of its behavior with time. You will see this further in the slides as well. Um, George Nee's procedural art and Saul Lewitt's work were a great point of reference in the studio in developing the procedural language, which is specific to a medium of exploration. Each machine engages with the user in a very unique way. Much like the playfulness seen in the works of Polish artist Karina Bobinski, a transparent globe filled with helium floating freely in a room, spiked with charcoals that leave marks on the walls, ceilings, and floor. Much like that, the students' work also kind of extrapolate a little bit on the same ideas. The idea of drawing with a code, drawing with a protocol, drawing with an instruction, and still having the playfulness in the machine. The works over here kind of explore the idea of fan blades rotating, the ink dropping, and the motors moving, making the ink, the fan, and the motors as the author rather than the students. Students are engaging with these machines. The project in this case looks at students develop their own modules to draw. They set procedures, they set protocols on whether a system has to be locally derived by a single module or it has to be globally driven by multiple modules. This project looks further into the idea of using magnets, paints, and iron filing, and then generating certain protocols, certain procedures in which these drawings would be made rather than being autonomous. The next projects look at observing started by observing the surface tension between ink and water and started to derive the parameters of change, which would allow students to critically analyze and draw conclusions. These changes allowed students to come with more informed methodologies than simply borrowing from the popular generative growth pattern codes. The growth patterns seen over here in most of these works are very popular differential growth patterns which are seen in nature and have been heavily kind of worked on in the computational or generative art fields. Again, these works are based on students exploring and adding certain parameters, the parameter of changes that they could insert, certain parameters of cuts of the paper, which can induce different patterns and different kind of formation. The same projects were then taken into digital platforms such as Grasshopper and many other plugins, which help them to further define their code and test their codes as well. This group, on the other hand, was looking at water, ink, soap, and brushes, and hands working, coordinating with the idea of time. In each of these slides, you must have noticed the idea of time becomes very, very important. Students tried to derive conclusions based on the time and the flow in which, or the way the growth pattern of each line grows, and tried to come up with certain drawings like these, or certain protocols and procedural drawings. The third category in my work, the third set in my work, explores learning the language of machines. This is an ongoing research, and it's a topic of a personal interest to me, where the architectural education is playing a heavy emphasis on digital skills. The introduction of digital technologies, the difference between architecture and other disciplines are being effaced. With these new opportunities, there is an increase in the number of architects shifting to other design fields, especially 3D printing. Many have used their skills to work in 3D printed body architecture, engaging in the field of fashion, product, furniture design, etc. Non-planar printing method seen over here in this slide is an exploratory study with a Cartesian printer done in an open source plugin for Grasshopper called Self-Form. Spatial plastic extrusion is a process where the nozzle head extrudes plastic in the air rather than in horizontal layer. This approach breaks free from conventional continuous fuse deposition methods and allows for discrete tool paths. Each print is unique to the paths taken by the printer. Conceptually, the same method can be applied to any numerically controlled fabrication machine and popular machines like CNC milling, router cutting, or laser cutting. The autonomous drawings and autonomous tool paths uses the intrinsic constraints of the fabrication process as opportunities and generative derivers in the design process. Autonomy of the machine and its material generates a method of printing specific to the behavior of the printers used here. The printer used over here is a DIY Cartesian coordinate printer set up at home, tinkered at home, played around with. The studies explore creating G codes. For G codes are these protocols in which one writes the instructions for the 3D printers. They are varied, the G codes are varied to the desired feed rate, speed of the nozzle, start and end extrusion. Taking into account both computational design and fabrication, this research is situated within a critical discussion of what fundamentally constitutes a digital object and a fabrication process. Again, these are some of the explorations done both at school and as personal research, where the DIY printers are tinkered and they are added on with certain material in fabric 3D printing. The material is laid and the printing is done on top of it rather than the conventional printing method, again using G code and using a machine control. And in the second image in the middle, a pen has been added, a small piece has been 3D printed to hold the pen, and the pen is continuously drawing. The other project which is currently in working is the idea of using a simple printer, Cartesian printer meant to print with the plastic material, is reproducing a much larger delta printer, which will be then fabricating out of clay. The idea over here is how do you switch from a small to big fabrication, and how do we use the DIY technologies to build bigger and build with more materials. I would like to end on the note that the current field of computational design is widely adopted thanks to the open source learning platform, discussion forums, or open frameworks, which allow the user to interact and adapt long lines of codes, proliferating a heterogeneous network of individuals interconnected by a single source code, almost creating these digital communities. It is interesting to note that a portrait of an architect is being defined less by their traditional roles within the construction industry and more by a certain creative outlook and design sensibility that could be deployed in other industries. I would like to end over here and would continue in the panel discussion. Uh, Dipti, off to you now.
Thanks, Bubbly. I think it was interesting to note one of your comments about the change of authorship, where instead of the students being the author, the machines have now taken up the authorship. It's very kind of interesting. And I remember one of the article which I think Prasad had shared with us, where the AI has started writing research papers. So who is the thinking beings now? Is the digital world kind of taking over with the whole process of thinking as well? Nice. I would now like to invite Dushyant Ashar to speak through his work. He's exploring the question of the body and the intelligence through the advent of the digital, the processes that shape the pedagogical space, and the emerging questions to interrogate the autodidact. Dushyant, please make your presentation.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks, Dipti. I'll try to forge a diagram today to kind of investigate the digital ecology of the body and the processes that enable experiences in those ecologies by a set of PowerPoint slides. Yeah. So, um, the fragments of bodies are getting sort of refabricated through the digital and its logics, and artificial intelligence sort of builds a new you from the data available from the archives on the internet. The protocols reconfigure us based on the AI's learning from big data. Parallelly, the bodies are doing the same. They are building a set of experiences that are reconstituting the experience of the body itself. So we are reconstituted as the environments we inhabit, and the objects with which we interact exhibit new properties and behaviors of a spatially intelligent being. The human body extends itself to include virtual, animated, and fabricated bodies. New appropriated instincts emerge from these heterogeneous relationships that define our being in a digital space. From developing a stealth tactic, escaping face recognitions and surveillance, to the anonymity of the hacker that skis through the firewalls. The constant dependence on our devices and digital social spaces that form the self that we are today. The experience of the fragments of our bodies reconstitute new bodily experiences that the big data reconstitutes as artificial intelligence. The human experience may develop a new spatial intelligence through an adopted set of reflexes and instincts that one builds in this ecology. So that's the kind of ecology that I'm trying to sort of build. And the other set of ecologies is the pandemic has proliferated. So this ecology is fragmenting all the other spaces that existed as locational silos, but active with a set of invisible networks. So especially since the pandemic, every activity, form of communication, and self experiences have found new ways to connect and express digitally. So the networks are explicit and open for anyone to join. Although the digital space is disproportionately accessible, it emerges a new model of participation and blurring of boundaries and make possible the choice to co-learn and engage with the world. So I'll try to bring in the question. I mean, this is the second part of the diagram where I bring in the question of the scale. The industrial hangover of scale especially, like if you see in the left and the right are both warehouses of Alibaba and Amazon. The industrial hangover of scaling production has its implication in the way we situate and produce our pedagogies. The digital economy reinforces the idea of scale, but technology and the computers are far more articulated to scale up or scale down. In the digital space, scaling of processing a billion operations is normal for a computer. That's what it does. But the same operation is an absurd activity for a human brain to think about. So the thinking frameworks of scale are shaping the processes for experiments and the institution and the digital. I mean, through the vision of the city by Corbusier and the assembly lines today, which are highly automated and highly digitized, it's still kind of in the framework of the scale. So through the DIY culture and open source communities, we possess a scope and possibility to produce, accommodate, record, and analyze each and every individual experiment, every human endeavor in pursuit of knowledge or innovation. So why do we still pursue scaling up? I mean, that's something that is kind of troubling. What would be the pedagogical process to think about scale in our processes? Even the technologies produced on a large scale has a capacity to be hacked and hence has a capacity to percolate into many processes. So through this, the DIY culture actually has disrupted the idea of scale, like placing the impetus to make within the loci of domestic spaces. It simplified the means and resources that one needs to engage in a process of making something that they needed. Usually, DIY are pursuits that one probably can't afford or don't have the resources to make. It brings down the aspiration of the scale, say in this case of a SpaceX rocket, to being manifested in a backyard, or these DIY processes. Although they are quite instructional, the human is very resourceful in hacking these methods to make their own, and that trips oneself into a process of making it happen. Also, a fact to share, I mean, I know we are speaking a lot about other things, but 90% of the built architecture produced in the country is by non-architects. So there is already a culture of manifesting self-built or DIY built spaces. This brings to a few experiments at sea. So we are engaged in a research project that is interrogating the digital and the analog process through certain techniques of engaging with the material. This is an attempt to make a doubly curved surface with glass fiber and resin composites using material computation and gravity as a model. So these coordinates of the logics of digital and the analog appear at an intersection of intuition and iteration. The capacity to process information and iterate so as to experience and intuit establishes the frameworks for this project. We are in some sense hacking the linearity of making process to new material learnings or to new material languages. In following up with that same experiment, the means of production and thinking frameworks in this case are reshaping how we think of precision or mass production. All of these projects are done by hand, made by hand, and made by one person. That was the kind of constant a limitation we had set for this project. The experiment shapes the material in specific geometries and is made possible through a method of crafting it by hand. Like it's completely folded and made by hand. It's even drawn by hand and even applied resin by hand, and everything is sort of done with that process. So this is also a project where it can scale up, it can scale down, it can accommodate itself in within the constraints, or it can become as big as possible. Similarly, these experiments were not produced in a lab. They were not produced in a resource-heavy context or a resource-heavy method of making. They were all built and made through our wood workshop, and also through the apparatuses or the frameworks that were made by the research assistant. So these pursuits also led us to uh, get into the space of cooking. We were quite interested in the new materials that are shaping, that are not explored yet by architects, and we thought to explore them through a process of temporality. We went to look at perishable materials, where a kitchen space became our lab, and we established this in a corner of the school with very simple everyday domestic utensils and materials that were partly made by us, by the research assistant also, and something that we could find in shops. So our network of procuring these material also were quite domestic, and the engagement, the activity of making them was also, which we do almost every day, which is like activity of cooking. This we are actually cooking new materials in a pantry, which has sort of become a lab for us. And these are also learnings from the machines that are producing a certain kind of architecture now. Like, for example, a 3D printer also operates on a similar logic, but we are trying to explore these possibilities within the reach of a intuitive or an iterative human effort. The pandemic also pushed us into an intensely digital workspace. Like, the earlier experiments were all done in school, but this particular work, which is in the center, was done at home. Like, there were many of these experiments which are done at home. The experiments were performed in the domestic space of their home, in and around their houses. The resources that one used to engage and interrogate the process of a machine opened up new practices that are performed in our everyday life, like learning from machines, not just by its digital ephemeral sort of logics which operate them, but also its physical manifestations. Like, a 3D printer for me was quite interesting, because it provided a new way to lay a material. It provided a new way to establish a material performance. So the same logic were used in the examples that you see in the center. A home device, or a clinical device, is sort of used to make this particular deposition of material. And if you see on the right, it is an act of cooking that opened up in our interrogation of these processes that are digitally charged, that actually intensified the argument of the tools and their separation from the design process. So, I mean, how does the mediated body sort of iterate and intuit the pedagogy of the self through the digital? So those are the interests that I've brought together today, and try to kind of forge a diagram for this. So I would stop sharing now. Yeah.
I can still.
Sorry. Yeah. So we take a small pause, and let me That's what the digital doesn't allow you. Yeah, the small pause. Yeah. Yeah. So I would like to sort of open, say, the panel with a question which I think we all can sort of relate to and kind of respond to, and then probably, from there we take on to our other interests. So how does one constitute a process through these experiences of the body in the digital, or the self in the digital? Like, what becomes the coordinate for a process of learning in this ecology? I would like to open this to all of you. Yeah, Kush, you want to? Yeah.
I think I'll start and just make a quick observation as well, that it's interesting how, Dushyant, you started your presentation with the kinds of iterations and innovations you practice in school, but ultimately it was the kitchen that became the sort of the home for the digital. And I think one way to begin to respond to that question is how each one of us was deeply personal in the narratives of the digital that we've shared. And so along that full spectrum, from the institutional and bureaucratic structures of the institution, all the way to the kitchen apparatus and the making of the digital, Bubbly's very methodical and sustained production of material experiences with the digital, and with me coming in with interrogating the digital in all of its humanistic and political connotations. One thing that sustained all of us and continues to perhaps keep all of us alive in the scholarship that we do is the implication of the self. And so, to your question of how does one constitute a pedagogical process in this ecology of the digital, no matter where you're entering it from, no matter what your focus might be, is understanding it not just as the kind of an epistemological process, a commitment to sort of producing new knowledge and thinking through questions and inquiries, but deeply, deeply thinking about the lived experiential dimensions of the digital in whichever material manifestation that might be. So I just wanted to sort of start with that, because we've seen 4 different materialities of the digital in these 4 presentations, but the self was a consistent marker that was just so refreshing to hear from co-panelists, but also refreshing to sort of think about in the discourse of architecture, which otherwise continues to think of the production and think of the practice as bodily and as material, but sometimes disembodied at the same time. So,
yeah. Can I go?
Yeah, Bubbly.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking on the same note as what Kush is mentioning about the pedagogy, and I was thinking on how would one kind of see oneself onto developing the pedagogies or methodologies. Also, one of the important things while considering or formulating of these exercises also for my works is the idea of again the idea of learning and the idea of unlearning it. So while developing the pedagogies also, one has to develop many tools to bring the thinking to a particular topic, to bring the thinking to just thinking through a procedural language, and to unlearn on whatever else you know about that particular domain. So at that point, at that instance in time, either you are engaging with what is being produced in front of you and you're forgetting everything else associated with it, or you are developing both at both the ends, at the end of you developing the pedagogies or the students working on it. It's important to unlearn, and it's important to begin learning new things and advancing towards these new things, which also kind of builds upon many of these branches onto the idea of digital to digital production. No? So I strongly feel that that's where I situate myself. That's where one kind of situates your self into the idea of pedagogies. Yeah.
And I would just like to kind of take it to the next step, and the where does the self sort of get located in the networks? I think we all sort of discussed about. I think the bureaucratic network that Dipti mentioned about, and the network of the community that Kush was embedded in. And I think in our case, I think the networks would, I mean, in your case, the digital sort of net. So I think where the self is kind of also placed within the network, and how does it kind of feedback into the process of learning for us as well. Yeah, Bubbly, yes.
Okay, I thought Kush was saying something. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'll kind of see it as the self located not towards the end of this network, but right in the core of this network. And I feel that this whole network of the open source community, because I spoke from the point of view of how one builds up this whole heterogeneous network. No, someone is architect and someone is a designer, or someone is just a person into electronics and is tinkering with a certain kind of a code. You have a heterogeneous network of these disciplines coming together, and one might locate themselves not as a two-dimensional network but almost like a three-dimensional, because you are producing from someone else's kind of work and you are producing for someone else to take it further. So when we are talking about the network, for me the open source network is the crux of many things and many studio exercises that happen. When it comes to the network of learning, again the authorship again goes away, and I've kind of elaborated on that as well. So I feel that the network is quite diluted in that sense, and one might find themselves somewhere around there. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
wanted Deepthi to come in before I share. Deepthi, let's hear from you as well.
Yeah.
So, no, so for me, I mean, I think the very restructuring of the bureaucratic process, which we are, the administrative process, which we are trying at the school, the idea that the each node of the network becomes the operator, and it's not an individual or the self which becomes the driving factor. So I think network and the idea of the self in this network is very important, because in the digital realm the network is expansive, right? There are the world has come very close, and you can expand the networks uh, at a very grand scale. But at the same time, these networks will hold its true value only when they work together as a system, as a mesh of things which kind of work together, as maybe gears work, where one is kind of dependent on the other, but it does not fail because one thing fails. So I think the self in the network is very important in that case, where each of the nodes of the network start operating as an individual important element, and not as an isolated being.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the network is also political. So it's not this endless reach into surfaces, materials, bodies, institutions, resources, and systems, but it definitely has a limit and it's elastic. And I wanted to quote one example. So, as part of the Queer Digital Humanities Network, we produced a zine about, I think, about 2 summers ago at one of the convenings. And, in the zine, we had It was a zine that came out of our collective work. And instead of sort of going ahead and issuing a copyright or a Creative Commons license to the zine, or just uploading it to one of the public servers so that it's downloadable, we issued a notice right at the sort of the back cover of the zine itself. And I'll just read it out, that this zine is not published in June 2019. It's a kind of a tongue-in-cheek humor, but it's not published in June 2019 by the members of the Queer DH community. All material contained in the zine is copyrighted by its respective creators, all rights reserved. The zine is intended to support the Queer DH community members and anyone with whom they choose to share it. Permission for items to be shared is granted specifically to those friends, to those allies, to those relatives of the Queer DH network that members believe will honor their commitments to each other, to our human and non-human kin, to the lands on which we live, and to those who are no longer with us, and is revocable at any time without prior notice. So the network is also sort of self, kind of determined from the inside out, saying that even though we have produced this and individual pieces are copyrighted to us, and currently we have it in the form of a zine, but it could be, we could share it with you, but we could revoke our access or your access to that zine anytime we choose. So I think what matters for when I work in the context of digital humanities is this stubborn commitment to political change making, come what may. And I think for as long as we share those commitments, and their translations could happen in various forms, but those commitments to each other, to our human and non-human kin, to also the kinds of lands on which we find ourselves either complicit in colonizing technologies or not, that is a driver for me in terms of what the network is, what its core is, but also what are the limits of that network.
It's interesting. I mean, there are two positions to see the network here, and I think one view of network is this open source thing which keeps on building itself, or maybe kind of it builds one project is sort of built many times over, and it kind of becomes another thing. And here, I think in your case, your example that it's a trusted set of a trajectory from where the work sort of moves along. So I think in these two cases, I think it's a very interesting one for somebody engaged in a project, in a learning environment. What do these sort of networks do? And both of them are equally politically charged. I mean, the openness of the data or the network, it allows anyone to sort of pick it up and kind of make things on their own self. And I think so I just would ask both of you to sort of open this up a little bit more to.
Dushnath, I think I lost last question. I'm sorry if I missed that last question. Sorry, because there was an internet outage.
Okay. I'll just repeat the last sentence. Oh, yeah. So I mean, in both cases, the network was quite differently sort of placed. How do you guys see? I mean, it also politically sort of placed in the sense the open source is kind of where the project becomes for everyone, and everybody is a part of that project. And in your case, it kind of curates itself its own way through across a certain set of community. Although it being a network, it's still a set of a controlled community from where it kind of proliferates to become a final, it takes another form. So how do you see that kind of journey through these networks, a project through these networks?
Good question. It's actually a very good question. I'm just thinking, I think one way to begin to sort of respond to it is going back to the question of scale. And I think because projects are not about scaling up or scaling down, but also at what scale are digital projects even possible and feasible, given the fact that the life of these digital projects, particularly those that live in the online world, have a certain kind of an end date to them if the constant maintenance of those digital projects is not really carried through. So yeah, I think project formulation within networks is as much a process and an outcome of the trust with which those projects are being built. But I think working with, again, the orientation, for me, my projects have a deep kind of an orientation towards learning with and from the other, or those who have been othered. And I think collectively, if we are able to identify the needs of that project in that time, then we are also able to sort of see that it's okay to have finite projects that don't endlessly proliferate and or come out of a system that continues to sort of make itself available for somebody else to build upon. But perhaps we need to define the limits as much as, for me, as much as it's about the possibility of defining the limits or delineating the limits of the network. It is also about delineating the limits of a project one step at a time, just so that one is able to then, because it's an anti-colonial lens, one is able to then say that it does not sort of end up being colonized and or is colonizing factor in the communities in which it kind of finds itself.
Dushan, can I come in?
Yeah, please.
I mean, just it's maybe the next set of discussions, but looking through the presentations and the works of the students, I have and the practice or the teaching learning process of technology, which I have been engaged with. Largely what I have seen is last 1 year we have been teaching online, and the realm of the digital is somewhere I found it limiting. In my so I wrote a chapter last year, which was based on technology as experience, where we were talking about pedagogic experiments which we were conducting at the school, where we were saying that learning is very intuitive and it's subjective. It's something which needs to be sensed. It's something which needs to be experienced by the body, and your senses kind of allow you to understand the weight of it. You understand you hear it, you taste it, you kind of smell it, and it's a very experiential kind of journey, the teaching learning process itself. And somewhere down last 1 year, where we have shifted to the digital mode, and it's not a question, but I would like to know your experiences with your students and your learning processes as to what are these senses which we are moving towards. Like for me, it's right now still very a detached understanding, where I feel the only two senses which are active in the digital realm are that of seeing and hearing, and the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of taste in this reconfiguration of the field, the classroom and the lab is kind of detaching ourselves with these sensorial experiences and learning techniques. So what were your experiences, and would you like to kind of elaborate on how do you see, like, are there new digital senses which we are moving towards, apart from the five senses which we already were working with? And how is this reconfiguration kind of, what is it moving towards as a journey? Kush, you would like to come in? Yeah.
I could, but may I ask Dishant or Bubbly, since they've worked with very specific projects, if you could start, and then I could.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's a very interesting question for me because I feel that the development of certain methodologies, because they were based on a very strict linear process of protocols and a linear way of giving the brief, and the students leaving up to the students to kind of experience and engage with whatever material is available. So in the first first 2 years of this studio, we did have the opportunity to kind of be engaged with the materials in its full sense, and with the fabrication machines as well present at the school. But during this time, we still could manage or manipulate the methodologies to fit the best possible way, which I now kind of reflect back upon is that, should we look at the methodologies to be able to adapt and readapt or morph into any kind of an ecology that we are put into, whether it's remote teaching, whether it's working closely, or whether partly working closely and part of the students or are located anywhere across the globe. So that is my first kind of a comment, where I would say that I did not find digital teaching or the remote teaching as limiting, but as a place of opportunity. And I would still kind of feel that for many other tools, right? So maybe that's my very personal take on it. And the second is the engagement with the new digital senses. Maybe I would also address a little bit on the technology front, is when you are saying the simulation of materials, when we are talking about the digital simulation of materials, and let's call it a little bit of lack of resources at times, a lack of digital resources at times, we are still not exposed into this whole realm of digital simulation of materials. But we just need to get exposed to it. But there are ways one could kind of take these digital simulation. And now the third part to your is the engagement of the self with these sensory kind of this thing. I don't know, Malab. I still kind of rely a lot on digital mediums. So I think yes, but when it comes to engagement with the material and tectonics of certain materials, I do feel limited, and I do feel like going back to the workshop and working over there. But I guess I'm still feeling like, let's take this as a place of opportunity than limiting, feeling it limiting. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I'll just come in here like I think 3 minutes, and then we open for
yeah,
audiences.
okay, okay, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a nice this thing, that is going on in my mind since a while. And I've been kind of trying to trace what is this new sensory experience, or a feedback that the body is kind of generating to these intense digital environments. Like, I see I mean, in the school we see students looking at 3 screens at the same time. Yeah, they're looking at 3 contents at the same time, and kind of maneuvering across all of them with ease. And I think if I mean, say for example, I don't know about all of you, but for me, my body can't process myself. I can't process that kind of information. And if I have to engage in that kind of an intensity, how does one really engage and process that kind of information? I mean, that there is a kind of a catching up to the processing of the computer. The brain is kind of very much doing that. On the other hand, there are many other instincts, or feedbacks or reflexes that we are sort of developing, like having a device like for everything, like for example, a messaging has taken our satisfaction of communication to someone, or a part of an emotional you can say emotionally satisfying behavior is through these kind of exchanges, or through a digital interface. Now that kind of detached, or that sense of feeling satisfied or feeling content through this interface is something that I'm still thinking about. But as a as an experiment that has happened in the school, I think the digital always gives us a number, or a graph, or a very specific figure, and to assess its experiential quality. I think that's something where, that's the same thing which a message does to us. Like a message is a written text which kind of keeps on being exchanged, but the impact of that on us is quite different. So I mean, but the larger question still remains of the pedagogy that that kind of emerges through this, and then what becomes of the institute now, what becomes of all of these experiences or all of these experiments that we are speaking about, what becomes the institute then, I mean, or what is the form of it? Like we are all sort of negotiating that form of the institute now through all of this. I think that would be kind of interesting to think about.
So, I just wanted to come in and Deepthi, just to bring it back to the question that you're asking each one of us. If the pandemic, I think has made visible some of the ways in which we have engaged, but other ways in which you felt your senses have not been fully been involved in the making and thinking. I feel there is a danger here that we are making an extremely ableist argument that all of us are able-bodied, and it was only with the pandemic that we began to realize that we were not able to smell or taste. And so I think if the question is that irrespective of the pandemic, there are bodies for whom the senses are heightened in different degrees and in different ways, then what is it about the digital that is able to be sensorial at the same time, but also variably sensorial? So I just wanted to sort of caution us against making a kind of an ableist framing to this pandemic and the digital work within it. Also, Ashley, who I work with as part of this practice, she writes very, very provocatively about traditional Filipinx tattoo practices. And there's a beautiful article by Cherokee scholar Angela Haas, and in a very influential piece called Wampum as Hypertext, she mentions that the traditional Filipinx tattoos are complex digital codes. So the whole process of tattooing is a complex kind of a coded practice that are created through ancient decolonial digital technologies requiring the very intimate work of the original digits, which are our fingers. So in all of these conversations of the digital, we forget that the original digits are our fingers. So whether we are using it to type, or whether we're using it to make, or whether we're using it to upload or even collaborate, I think that embodiedness is there, which is something that I spoke with my students as well. And I'll just quickly wrap up with this example that because we did a kind of a digital community engaged studio that involved the lives of fisherfolk and indigenous practices, fortunately building on the archival work that started last year. But nevertheless, I would always remind students that for these indigenous fisherfolk, their eyes are at their fingertips. When they go into the sea, it's through what they touch that they're able to see. And similarly, I ask my students, what does it mean to touch smell? Or what does it mean to read about sound? And so if we can sort of connect these sensorial imaginations, which the digital would allow us to do, I think, in quite embodied ways, then that opens up a real inclusive possibilities of making and thinking with architecture and space as well, is where I would, possibly end.
Okay, so good, I mean, a good thought to sort of open to questions from the audiences. So Rishabh has a question. Can we give him,
Yeah, I have given him talking.
Rishabh, you can speak, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi everyone. So actually I wanted to understand the relationship between bureaucracy and the self, and why the idea of self is so prevalent in these times of digital. Hello.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, very quickly to respond, I would not say that, there are two different entities. and be it the physical realm or be it the self or be it the digital realm, it's all together. It's one constructing the other, and it's almost like where we are talking about, even in bureaucratic systems, we were talking about a vertical mesh, a vertical top down approach, and a horizontal system which is kind of passing by the vertical system of which is a top down approach. So I would not the question which you pose is, why is the idea of the self so prevalent in the times of digital? So I do not see them as two different entities, but they are two entities which are constructing each other, and they are dependent on each other to kind of uh, be there or function as a system, a network of things. So it's not about one against the other, it's one with the other, I would say.
No, is there in everything, is in everything, but we recognize this so startling in the actually we recognize this so starting in these digital time. That is what I was trying to get, because when we draw also, now the idea of self is there also, but we don't usually talk about that. We do sometimes when we think about it or talk about it deeply, but in
So
terms
you're
of
saying the
this,
separation is stark in the digital realm of the self, is it?
yeah, we start to talk about it in these times.
Yeah, so I think that was also somewhere where I opened that question about the limitations of the senses, no? Where if I'm able to articulate it well, I think the digital, and see, the digital was, it's not that the digital is new. The digital always was there, even the pre times of lockdown, right? But it's just that we were not completely embodying it and utilizing the digital world, and now we are forced to kind of be into that space and to appropriate it and use it. And that's why I think the shift is what is trying or posing these questions to us. We see these limitations coming up and cropping to us because we are kind of forced into this realm of using the digital, and there's no other realm where you can enter into. But where in otherwise, if there was no lockdown, if there was no limitation of being only in the digital realm, then that possibility of merging various mediums or kind of blurring the boundaries and being proliferating in these various mediums would have eased the process of these disconnects.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We also have Prasad. Prasad, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Quickly. I just want to kind of get into the question of pedagogy, in a sense that Dipti speaks about friendship, and Kush about the digital sociability, and Dushyant about the kitchen, and Baulin about the hack. So now, do you all want to kind of speculate how does how does how do these things, the friendships, the digital sociability, the kitchen, and the hack, how does it shape y'all as teachers and as students, as what do you expect, what do you want to teach the student, or like, for example, I mean, if I were to kind of what y'all make, what y'all will produce together is a friendly hacker who will make good food and host a lot of parties, which is a nice thing to do, actually. How do you want to kind of think about teaching, learning, and particularly architecture and architectural education, from where you all are entering the discussion? It's very nice. I mean, I love it. I just want to figure out what are the how do you want to set the coordinates for an institute and for teaching of architecture from here, actually. That'll be very important. And I think that whole idea, which I think Dipti spoke about, and then Kush kind of opened it really well, the idea of the digital sense, the digital sensibility or digital senses. I think that has a lot of promise also. For me, that is one of the coordinates definitely. How do you think about uh, technology? Anybody wants to kind of I was just thinking, like Bubbly Naru, and
Yeah.
even Dushyant, you all have been also teaching
Yeah.
actively, no, in the sense that
Right.
you want to kind of speculate how.
Yeah. I'm glad, Prasad, you asked this question, because of time we were going to cut short on this, but this is one of the questions that we were also discussing, is how would we see the institute also, no? If I were to kind of see, then what does the institute become if everything is to be done at home and it's only produced by one single machine? If it's only that Ender 3 printer that I have is producing most of the things and is helping me to learn, and I'm unlearning and learning new things out of it, and then I have my laptop in front of me. So what does then institute become is the question and discussion we all were having, that does then institute only becomes a place to have cross-disciplinary exchanges? Maybe it becomes a place where I'm able to acquire knowledge about other disciplines, like maybe what's happening at the MIT Media Lab, where you have a biologist, you have a designer, then you have an architect, and everybody is kind of working together, like you said, as friends. And or does the institute become a place of providing the not so affordable infrastructure, robotic arm, or does it provide you with a community participation and a one single machine helping to kind of build multiple things which otherwise would not be possible for me to afford? So I kind of do have these as my questions, that what would the institute become? And when it comes to the teaching bit, I still kind of believe in the fact that one has to start thinking with the tools. What we were forced to think now, we should be teaching and as well as working with these tools. So yeah, that's kind of my take, more of a still a comment and a question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bobby, may I just continue
Yeah,
from
yeah, 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 yeah.
because Prasad, this Bobby's question of what does the institution become has been on our minds for a bit. But coming back to this, I think it's great that you return us back to pedagogy. And one of the things that that keeps coming back, that we keep coming back to, and keeps sort of keeping us engaged as well, is this idea of that if everything is open source, everything is available, and one is able to be an autodidact in the sense of really sourcing that information and then putting it together, a kind of kit of parts, and then you make and you remake, and you're able to sort of have your single practice. I think what the pedagogical implications are methodological. So what it does is whether we come from a humanistic end of the spectrum or the kind of the digital technological end of the spectrum, the fact that all four of us have found each other is valuable at one level to be able to share strategies. But what we are able to engage students in is a kind of an honest teaching and encouraging of developing methodologies, which is at the heart of architectural pedagogy, right? And so, how do you teach inquiry-based methodologies that would sustain them beyond the realm of those 5 years that they are within the program, but also whether or not the digital is still part of their reality the way it is now, or it changes tomorrow? I think that methodological training is what the institution, to answer Bobby's question and to your question of pedagogy, is the anchoring point for me.
So if I were to kind of just I'll take just 1 minute. If I were to kind of elaborate that, so methodology to engage with material, with people, with species, with a whole series of things, or with emerging technologies. So it's a methodology for that, uh, uh, that you will be that you are kind of setting up methodologies
Yeah.
for doing that, huh? So
Yeah. I mean, it's what Cedric Price used to say, right? That if technology is the answer, what is the question? And I think so. Methodology is this kind of the thread that connects the question to a set of approaches to then whether the project is about making, or is it, in my case, a kind of a genealogical project that critiques the very genealogy of the tools that we are using enough to be able to say that even ArcGIS, for example, has a deep colonialist orientation to mapping landscapes. And so what would be an alternative way to begin to map spatialities that are much more inclusive of and responding to the land practices and spatial practices on the ground. So I think there is much diversity there, but yeah, I would say.
So if I were to qualify, because it's very important, because I want to kind of, because so from Bubbly we get the idea of setting up infrastructure, and which is the resources to experiment actually. And from you we get the idea of I can I qualify it as soft methods, soft methodologies to kind of engage with the world, because I'm saying soft because then they can overlap and they're not, they can be new and there can be changing inside, etc. And then from Dipti and Dushyant, we are getting this whole idea of digital senses, the sensibilities. How do we kind of figure out ways in which the sensibilities kind of start getting responded to, or responding to the digital, the sense and the digital. What is it? What are the interactions possible there? So these are the coordinates that are emerging for pedagogy, which is quite nice actually. Thanks guys.
Thank you, Prasad, and all of you. We are out of time now. Unfortunately, it's 7, and we have another session after this. So thank you all. It was great. It was a nice discussion. Thanks, Kush. Thanks, Bavleen, and everyone. Sorry, there are some more questions, but I think we need to end now. Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks, Dipti, as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dushyant, Deepti.
We'll have our next session at 7:15. So please stay back for it. Thanks, Kush. Thanks, Bhavli.
Thanks, Prasad.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All of you. Both of you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Vikank, are you there? Do you want to test your audio?
Hi, Deepti, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I had to bother you in the middle.
No.
Yeah, it's working now. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, you want to